Welcome to the chapter on conflict. When we talk about conflict, we need to remember our goal within this course. Because conflict has become such a big social concern that it would be easy to step back and try to look at the many dynamics that occur within a society that create conflict between one group and another. However, we're focusing now on the interpersonal aspects of conflict and those relationship conflicts that we encounter. What we want to talk about is how managing conflict comes about, the psychology of conflict, discrimination. We'll take a short break, come back and start talking about conflict in relationships, power in conflict, how conflicts end, and what happens with unresolved conflicts. Managing conflict and power. In order to begin addressing how we manage conflict, we need to first define conflict. And conflict is when people perceive incompatibility based on goals. In other words, someone stopping you from achieving a goal. Someone stops you from finding your objectives or living a fulfilling life. That is the root for conflict within relationships. To manage that conflict, we need to start breaking down each part of it so that we can then decide how we get to those final few slides that talk about endings of conflict. And that is how we find our route to managing conflict. The psychology of conflict. The psychology of conflict, of course, goes back to what? The conflict theory. The conflict theory basically says that humans are in constant competition for resources. That resource can be money, it can be food, it can be property, it can be commodities. There's so many material items that we can have conflict over. And as we compete for these things, we create conflict. In our communication style, we oftentimes encounter a win or lose situation. Such as if we go back to when we were talking about invitational rhetoric, and amongst the 5 different forms of rhetoric that we engage in, the first 2, the most common ones we engage in, are related to conflict. Because we have the conquest where we want to conquer the other person. That, of course, is conflict. And conversion is another form of that, where we're still saying, you're wrong, and you're keeping me from my goals. And that is the type of communication we often engage in. So we need to learn how to move beyond that. One of the things is, we need to realize it goes beyond just material things. Our conflict isn't just tied to money, food, housing, those type of items. They're not all material. We can have conflict over aspects of emotions. We can have conflict over social connections. We've had fights with friends when we felt someone else was someone's best friend, and that meant they weren't my best friend, and since they're not my best friend, I dislike you and I dislike them, and so we're going to have conflict over it. We can have conflict over our partners in relationships. We can have conflict over many different things, to include the amount of attention, the amount of time, the amount of physical contact we have with a person. All of these are resources within our mind. Now, how we're perceiving many of those resources can lead to our conflict, and is based on how we're correlating these resources. And if we misinterpret the information, that leads to conflict, such as we can have an illusionary correlation. As we mentioned, we talked about material resources, which seem definitely finite in some ways. We can have arguments about how much gas there is. Do we have it, because less gas means higher price. Higher price means costs more money. and money is a limited resource. But in the illusionary ones, what we start to see is people are making connections when there aren't connections there. Because correlation is not causation. We'll hear that, we've heard it, and we'll hear it again. What we're talking about in this aspect is that, let's say we have limited time in a day, right? There's only 24 hours in a day, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. That's all limited. And we only are on this earth for so long, so our time is limited. And if we're looking at, oh, in this relationship, that person's just not giving me enough time, so they don't love me, so there's conflict, so there's an issue. However, perhaps what we're not looking at is the bigger picture. Maybe the reason why the person isn't spending that extra time with you is because they're out trying to work that extra job to provide something for you or to share something with you. And so we create this where, oh, they're not spending time with me so they don't love me. Meanwhile, the actual causation is they're not spending time with you because they do love you. There's the other one too, the zero-sum fallacy, where we think that there's a limited number. There's a limited number of hours in the day. Is there a limited amount of love we can give to another person? Or is there a limited number of love we can give, period? Is there a limited amount of rights? Basically, in the zero-sum fallacy, people feel that in order for someone to get attention, to get love, to get rights, somewhere it has to be going away. You know, like a dollar. If you're going to spend $1 at the bank or $1 at the grocery store, that means you have one less dollar in the bank. That's not the case with everything, though. That's a zero-sum fallacy, that some things aren't limited and are not a limited resource. So when we have conflict over them, we're actually fighting over something that isn't truly limited. As we start to create these illusionary correlations, we start to discriminate against people. Now, we normally think of discrimination on the big level, you know, society, but it can happen within a family, as small as a family. Think about it. If a child gets an A and his sibling gets a B, who do we praise? Who do we encourage? We start encouraging the child that got the A. But that can be discriminative towards the other child. So it can begin at a very small level, and then it can move into the workplace, and it can move into society from there, and we find reasons to discriminate on the individual basis, from prejudice, from bias, from stereotypes. All these things can lead to discrimination. Now, oftentimes, it's the most common, and not only is it the most common, but it's often hidden. I mean, if someone's to ask us, well, which child do you love more? Oh, I love my children equally. They're the same to me. That might be your goal, but what is your action saying? You know, so you need to work on how you're actually building those small relationships and finding a way to avoid discrimination on that level. It's unintentional. It definitely is unintentional between parents and children. It can be unintentional at workplace, you know, and it could go back to, like I was saying, it could go back to culture. It can go back to sphere of social groups, sphere of influence. All those things can lead to individual discrimination. If you step up from there, you start talking about organized or institutional discrimination, where they have established rules for a long period of time that benefits one group over the other. If you look at the story of Walt Disney back in the 1950s, Walt Disney felt that men were more creative and that he would only hire men to do the illustration on the Disney animation projects. Women, they could do the inking and they could do the coloring because that wasn't a creative process. However, what that created is within that company, there was open and clear discrimination that was based on rules from the founder. Now, we've all learned that creativity exists within each person. And that it really doesn't matter if a person is male or female or how they identify gender or their culture. Creativity is a unique and wonderful spark in every individual. So that became organized discrimination within that company. It also can happen within political institutions. It can happen within companies. It can happen within cities where it gets to be the good old boys club is one way they reference it, where we only hire this person that meets this profile. Meanwhile, the other people that don't perfectly fit that profile don't get that opportunity. That's another form of discrimination. So we've talked about individual, we've talked about organized. Next, we have structural one. Now, structural can be environmental factors come into play with this, where, okay, what we're going to do is on this section of town, we're going to build the big houses, the expensive, nice houses. And next to those nice houses, we're going to put those nice schools, and we're going to bring in the best educators. Well, that area of town just got benefits because of an inequality that there's being created within development of the city. Because that means those people that live in that area get the benefit of education, housing, and of course, if there's more money in that area, there's going to be more employment of higher income possibilities. So you'll see this sometimes when they build a tech center, and around that tech center is going to be people with more opportunities than in the older neighborhoods that the people that work blue collar jobs are living in. Because that area isn't going to get the tax money because the higher taxes are coming from the rich area. So they don't get the same share. And this becomes a structural form of discrimination. And it can be supported by government regulations or even government actions or political groups. And this is a hard one to really address, and this is what we see more as we're talking about the conflict that we're seeing in greater society. But realize it can come down to the individual level, in that in the individual level, are you saying someone's from the wrong side of the tracks so you don't think they're as educated? You see where I'm going here? We're developing a bias, we're developing a prejudice and a stereotype. And so that is going to limit your possibilities of developing an interpersonal relationship with a person, or if you do, it might limit your actual growth as a relationship. We're going to take that break. I'm going to give that back. We don't have 3 chapters to cover this week, just this one, because it is a big topic. So at this point, you can go ahead and give it a time where you felt that you've witnessed discrimination of some types, or an illusionary correlation that you see. Something, anything from this chapter, go ahead and give me a story. I love your stories. They really connect, and they really expand upon our topics.